Welcome and thank you for coming to the Izzy Awards. I'm Diane Gajewski. I'm the Dean of the Park School of Communications. We're very happy to have you here, and we're especially happy to have the Park Center for Independent Media as a part of the Park School. In its short couple of years of existence, it's made a tremendous impact, not only in the Park School, but in the Ithaca community. And I'm sure that some of you have taken advantage of some of the other terrific speakers that we've been able to bring in this year. I want to especially thank the Park Foundation. It's their support. Their support makes possible not only the Izzy Award, but the Park Center for Independent Media. And without further ado, I want to turn over the program to Jeff Cohen, who has some welcome and some interesting new announcements. Thank you again for coming.
It's a little too dark in here. Pick up the lights. Yeah, that's a little better. Thank you, Dean Gajewski. She's been a major supporter of our center, and she's our permanent, not just our interim dean at the Park School of Communications. This is the night of the year when we put aside the Oscars and the Grammys and the Tonys and the Emmys, and we make way for the Izzies. The award for special achievement in independent media, that is, media outlets that operate outside of traditional corporate structures. The award is named after Izzy Stone, the independent journalist whose newsletter, I.F. Stone's Weekly, challenged war, corporate profiteering from war, racism, McCarthyism, loyalty oaths. It was a newsletter that championed civil liberties. It exposed government hoaxes like the Gulf of Tonkin incident that opened the floodgates to the Vietnam War, and these lies were exposed in real time, week after week, as soon as the lie got its boots on, much like the winner of this year's Izzy Award. You know, when a group of prominent journalists and academics got together to choose the top 100 works of journalism in the United States in the 20th century, they ranked I.F. Stone's Weekly number 16. 3 years after Izzy stopped publishing the Weekly, in 1971, a karmic descendant of Izzy Stone was born, and his name was Jeremy Scahill. Tonight's award ceremony is being broadcast live on radio throughout the Finger Lakes District, thanks to WEOS, a Democracy Now! Affiliate. And it's heard in Ithaca thanks to the rebroadcast of WEOS programming on Ithaca Community Radio. So greetings to our radio listeners in Ithaca and Geneva and beyond, and thank you, WEOS, for being here. This is a great opportunity, as the Dean mentioned, to make an announcement that we're very proud of. The Park Center for Independent Media has just expanded its staff. We have a new associate director. Some of you are familiar with her. Our new associate director is Maura Stevens. Let's hear it for Maura. And one more announcement. Thanks to the generosity of the Izzy Stone family, and thanks to the hard work of another one of our staffers, Brandy Hawley, we have set up a display case in the Park School of Communications right near the dean's office that has Izzy Stone's typewriter. It has letters of praise for Izzy from people like Eleanor Roosevelt, Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein. We have a check for a year's subscription to the I.F. Stone Weekly, which cost $5, a $5 check for the Weekly signed by Albert Einstein. Other great memorabilia. So check out our display case near the dean's office in the Park School. Many of you were in attendance last year when we had our first Izzy Award, shared by blogger Glenn Greenwald and the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman. Our award has come a long way since. This year, we received dozens and dozens of nominations. Powerful journalism is being produced by independent media outlets, national, local, groups we hadn't even heard of, outlets we hadn't heard of. You know that the mainstream media is not only in a financial crisis, but a spiritual crisis, both crises caused largely by corporate greed. The good news is that a number of independent media are flourishing, and no one knows that better than the Izzy Award judges. The panel was made up of communications professor Robert McChesney, journalist Linda Jew, and myself. From all of this great work that we went through, all of the nominations, there was one independent journalist whose work seemed to rise above and apart. And I want to run now a short video of this individual journalist appearing on national television.
Get this, there are now more private contractors in Afghanistan than there are U.S. soldiers. And as of next year, according to new Pentagon documents, the war in Afghanistan will be costing more than the war in Iraq. It's the job of experienced, knowledgeable investigative reporters to throw a monkey wrench into the spin machine and try to make some sense of all this. They're an endangered species, but one of the best in the business is Jeremy Scahill, who's been digging into Pentagon documents and thick congressional hearings for several years now. He's twice winner of the George Polk Award for Special Achievement in Journalism and author of this best-selling book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Jeremy now runs the new website, Rebel Reports. Jeremy Scahill, welcome back to the Journal.
It's great to be with you, Bill.
How do you explain this spike in private contractors in both Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think what we're seeing under President Barack Obama is sort of old wine in a new bottle. Obama is sending one message to the world, but the reality on the ground, particularly when it comes to private military contractors, is that the status quo remains from the Bush era. Right now, there are 250,000 contractors fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's about 50% of the total U.S. fighting force, which is very similar to what it was under Bush. In Iraq, President Obama has 130,000 contractors, and we just saw a 23% increase in the number of armed contractors in Iraq. In Afghanistan, there's been a 29% increase in armed contractors. So the radical privatization of war continues unabated under Barack Obama.
Blackwater, the rise of the world's most powerful mercenary army. His latest reporting on Blackwater can be seen online on thenation.com. Jeremy Scahill is over here. Jeremy, how are you, my friend? You were the guy who started all this about Blackwater. You had the book years ago. We had you on the show talking about it. And they're back in the news in a big way this week. Did you ever think when you started with Blackwater they turned out to be such a lucrative franchise for you?
The Obama administration continues to contract with Blackwater. The fact is that what we saw after 9/11 was this mercenary force run by Eric Prince, an avowed Christian supremacist, essentially embed itself in the U.S. national security apparatus. And beginning in 2002, was providing private soldiers for hire to the government, initially on covert CIA contracts. But now, for instance, Blackwater has a $100+ million contract in Afghanistan. They guard top U.S. officials there. They're still in Iraq, armed right now. And we understand they also are working covertly for the CIA as part of the drone bombing.
How many, does the media ever say 3 Blackwater soldiers were killed, or Hessians, or whatever you want to call them?
We don't always know.
Okay.
That's the other thing.
Right.
We'll find out. There are Hessians. Some of them are.
Right. Let's remember here also, though, that Blackwater, which has now been identified as a central participant in the CIA assassination program, hired senior Bush administration CIA officials to run Eric Prince's private CIA. Cofer Black, who ran the Counterterrorism Center on 9/11, the Hunt for Bin Laden, Blackwater employee. Robert Richer, former Deputy Director of Operations, Enrique Rick Prado. They have a private CIA working for the U.S. government and simultaneously working for the foreign government.
Let me get to the story.
Why are you still alive? Are you paranoid? That's it. I mean, it's an amazing book that you've written. I'm curious that that guy had everything more. Oh, he's dead. What happened? He had an accident. I mean, and here you sort of, I mean, do you
They're actually, there are actually accusations.
Iraqi and Afghan people that are forced to face down against them when, I'm sorry, the U.S. Congress does nothing to stop it, and journalists have done nothing to hold the White House accountable now, Chuck, or under Bush. This has not been an issue, and yet it constitutes more than half of the fighting force in Afghanistan. And Iraq right now,
it's fine. I know. I represent everybody. Yeah, Chuck. Comedians have had no part. Comedians have played no role in any of this.
No, but no, Chuck, you called it political catnip to talk about the CIA and Cheney's role in this because it distracts from the important issues. This is a central issue, and you called it cable catnip.
Because what happens and what is it going to get turned into? A political food fight where you can't get anything done. Congress would not be able to get any prosecutions done. And worse yet, the prosecution that you would want to have, the prosecution
that would get done.
But the prosecution that you would like to see would end up, and if it gets, and you don't get it, and then you find out that it provides some immunity farther along, and you find out you can't try these folks?
But how can Secretary Clinton go to Kenya?
Okay, but let me.
Now Jeremy Scahill of The Nation is reporting that the chair of the House Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, is launching an investigation into just what the Blackwater employees were doing at that base that day and what else we and Congress don't know about what Blackwater is still being paid by the U.S. government to do. Joining us now is Jeremy Scahill. He's author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Jeremy, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Rich.
When word first came in of the attack on that CIA base in Khost on December 30th, 6:44 p.m. that day, you tweeted, re-attack on CIA base in Afghanistan. Mark my words, contractors were killed. How did you know?
I heard it from sources that from within the military and intelligence community that told me that there were Blackwater contractors among the dead that day. They were still confirming that it was Blackwater and not another company. So when I tweeted it, that's why I didn't specify from what company, but I did know at that point that at least U.S. intelligence was of the understanding that Blackwater guys were there that day. First of all, we have to look at the whole disaster profiteering industry right now. I mean, we saw this start in New Orleans where Blackwater and others got all these contracts. They show up literally on the scene, and then after they're there working, then they get some kind of legitimate government contract and make a killing off of these operations. I think that the primary concern here is there has to be some rule of law, and if there's one thing these companies are known for around the world, it's operating in a lawless environment. So I think that that it should be a Haitian-led initiative. The Haitian government's sovereignty should be respected. Haiti should call the shots on who comes into the country. If Haiti says we don't want mercenaries here, there shouldn't be mercenaries there. When they talk about looters, and this is how they benefit because they hype up the looting. Yeah. Looting was what happened in Iraq on the part of war corporations. People struggling to find food after an earthquake is called survival. Yeah. The real looters are the companies.
Jeremy Scahill, reporter for The Nation, author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Whenever I read stories like this, even when you don't write them, I think of you.
I want to thank Phil Stafford, TVR student, for editing that. You know, it was Izzy Stone's courageous, lonely critiques of Senator Joe McCarthy week after week that made it easier much, much later for Edward R. Murrow and some of the reporters in the mainstream media to finally address the demagoguery coming from Senator McCarthy. And Izzy Stone exposed the lies of Vietnam week after week, way before the New York Times and CBS News found their skeptical voices. And similarly, it was Jeremy Scahill's relentless, lonely, pioneering journalism that pushed the issue of military contractor abuses into the mainstream this past year. Like Izzy, Jeremy did his reporting for independent outlets, The Nation, Democracy Now!, Common Dreams, Alternet, and his own blog. I encourage you to go to rebelreports.com. Before I turn over the proceedings to tonight's award winner, I have a message that was sent to us from Dr. Jeremy Stone. He maintains the wonderful official ifstone.org website, and he is the elder son of Esther and Izzy Stone. This is what Jeremy Stone sent us, quote, "In 1953, my age group was required to register for the draft. I well remember that this lottery of life was a serious matter. Draftees only a year or two older than ourselves had already died in Korea. Today, the United States, along with 90 other countries, has abandoned the draft in favor of the use of volunteers. This has obvious advantages and the unfortunate disadvantage of liberating the government's decision to use military force from the political pressures that would exist were the sons of middle and upper class citizens subject to the draft. The commercial outsourcing of the use of force further distances the American political process from its authorized violence. Blackwater in Iraq is a descendant of Vietnam-era contractors like Brown and Root. I.F. Stone recognized the corrosive impact of lucrative deals for these outfits, and Jeremy Scahill has shown that the role and influence of contractors are even greater now than they were in Vietnam. As Jeremy has shown, outsourced force has been harder to control than conventional military force. Jeremy's important investigative reports have been hard-won, requiring courage, commitment, and endurance. It seems that the Izzy Award Committee has chosen for its second award some kind of grandson of I.F. Stone, unquote. I present to you the winner of the second annual Izzy Award, Jeremy Scahill. I'm going to read you the inscription and then skedaddle. The courageous spirit of I.F. Izzy Stone is alive and thriving in the tireless work of independent journalist Jeremy Scahill.
I'm just deeply, deeply humbled by this award, and you know, when I was in Colombia, the nation of Colombia, when Jeff Cohen was first informing me about this award, and I think he thought I was avoiding him because I didn't really get back to him right away. But when I heard it, I couldn't. Part of me just couldn't believe it. To hear your own name in the same sentence with I.F. Stone is I mean, it's awesome in the literal sense of the word, but it's also humbling, and I feel this great sense of responsibility moving forward now that I will have my name affiliated with this award. Like, I really have something I have to live up to now. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful to the Izzy Award Committee, to I.F. Stone's family, and Jeremy Stone in particular for such a beautiful and moving statement. I also want to thank Adelaide Gomer and the Park Center for Independent Media, the Park Foundation, to Ithaca College, to the staff and faculty here. This is my second time here, and I think you just have an incredibly wonderful community of faculty and students, and you all should be incredibly proud of the kind of students that you're producing, because it's a rare place that you have here, particularly when it comes to building independent media through, well, official means, through universities. There's other ways of building independent media, but I've never seen anything like the Park Center for Independent Media in officialdom, and it's an incredible, incredible place. We're living in a time right now that begs for political, moral, journalistic courage. The kind of courage that was embodied by I.F. Stone in his time. You know, when there's someone in power that you like on a personal level, or that you can relate to on a personal level, or shares your own party affiliation, sometimes it's easy to shelve your conscience. And I think we're seeing a lot of shelving of consciences in this country right now because of who is in power. If there ever was a moment in modern U.S. history when actual change could be put into place, it would be now, if we had an actual two-party system. If we had a multi-party system, if we didn't have one party masquerading as two, which the hard reality is that's what things look like on a policy level, not on a personality level. That's not what journalists have an obligation to monitor and document. We're supposed to be following the policies and the actions much more than we are the words, the personalities, and who we may like or find attractive in one way or another as a politician or a political candidate. And I'm going to talk in depth about the challenge for independent media in these times in a moment. But first, I wanted to return to my friend Chuck Todd for a second, who was shown there on the videotape. You know, there's a whole saga that happened after that confrontation happened. First of all, I have to back up a bit. You know, it's weird to watch these clips on the screen. I never like to see any TV things after I do them, because I just feel embarrassed and realize that I probably should shave, and you know, it's, you know, but I also watch them, and I just kind of think, like, how the hell do I end up in those places? Because when I was growing up, people like me weren't allowed on corporate media outlets, and I still, every time I get a call to be asked to be on any of those shows, it's always a really strange. It's like one of my friends pulling a joke on me. But anyway, I'm on the show, and Jay Leno's on the show, and my mom was like freaking out about it. Jay Leno. So anyway, I went there, and I brought my friend Sharif Abdel Qaddus from Democracy Now! With me out to LA for that show, and we were sitting in the green room beforehand, and Jay Leno had driven like some kind of 1930 vehicle in mint condition to the thing, and he comes in, and he's wearing like a jean shirt, and then he changes into a suit. But I thought, wow, Jay Leno's going to appear on this TV show wearing a blue jean shirt. So we're chatting with him, and Chuck Todd is there, just stiff as a brick, and everyone's kind of chill about everything. And they give you this packet when you go on Bill Maher's show of like all the articles that could potentially be discussed that night. And so they were like handing them out in the hall, and I happened to have been out in the hall, so I had mine, and I come in, and Chuck Todd is like, what's that you're holding there? And I was like, oh, it's all the documents for tonight. And I was just kind of like joking. He's like, well, I didn't get that. Let me see that. And he like took it from me. I was, it ain't the Pentagon Papers, Chuck. Like, so, and it's fine, whatever. Chuck clearly had never heard of me, and that's fine. Most people haven't. And so I went up. I was talking to Jay Leno, who was actually very nice, and I know Congressman Jan Schakowsky, so we were all kind of chilling. And I wasn't on the panel for the whole night. What happened was that the three of them were going to have a discussion with Bill Maher, and then they were going to they brought me on like 20 minutes into the hour-long show to talk a little bit about Blackwater being in the news at that time, and then I would join the panel discussion. And so when I came on, and what wasn't necessarily clear from the clip is that there was supposed to kind of be a moment where Bill Maher and I had a back and forth, and Chuck Todd kind of like interrupted it to give his, what they call it sometimes in documentary film, the voice of God, like, the actual truth of the matter, that we don't actually know who these guys are, these Blackwater guys. Mind you, this is last year. They'd been in Iraq from the beginning and in Afghanistan, since 2002. But Chuck Todd and the corporate journalists didn't know who they were. And that's why I then, pointed out Chuck's comments where he was doing his best to impersonate Robert Gibbs, the White House spokesman, which he does on a regular basis from the lawn of the White House. You can't tell if it's Chuck Todd or Robert Gibbs. He's a stenographer for the powerful, the way that Fox was a stenographer for the powerful when Bush was in power. So we go on with the show, and everything ends. And Chuck Todd is a guy who is on TV every night and all through the day, and has constant access to the public airwaves, probably more than almost any other journalist. Chuck Todd is on TV like 24/7 from the White House lawn. So as we're sort of leaving, you go through this thing as you're going off the stage where they take off your microphone and your earpiece, and there's interns and other people there who say, "Oh, you all did such a great job tonight." They're like told. So we're going through this process, and Chuck Todd is like running away with all of the equipment on, and they're kind of stopping him, and so everyone's kind of, we're like in this like really narrow hallway, and Jay Leno's here, and Jan Schakowsky's here, and Chuck Todd's here, and I was kind of behind Chuck Todd, and he has his back turned to me, and he looks at me out of the corner of his eye, and he says, "That was a really low blow." And I kind of look at, Jay Leno and I are now like real buddies and stuff, I look at Jay Leno like, and I was like, well, what was a low blow, Chuck? And he goes, just the whole thing. He's like, man, just the whole thing. And I said, well, hold on, because I could tell he was about to have, like a fit. Like if anybody's ever seen the Bill O'Reilly F It, I'll Do It Live. Like I thought it was going to be something like that. I know we're on radio, Jeff, so I did this. No need to bleep me. You're lucky they're not showing my Twitter feed, which is always full of, anyway, never mind. So Chuck says, just the whole thing. And I said, well, hold on, Chuck. I watch you regularly. I follow your work. And I just want you to tell me, was there anything that I said tonight that was not true or accurate? And he whips around and says, that's not the point. You sullied my reputation on TV. That's a direct quote. You sullied my reputation on TV. And it was like his reaction. It was literally Jay Leno goes, whoa, and Jan Schakowsky's like, shock. Because it was literally like a volcano was going to explode. And I'm thinking to myself, and the sort of Irish Catholic rebel in me wanted to like say this out loud, except I only said it later behind his back. You sully your own reputation, Chuck, every day with the way that you pose as a journalist. Anyway, so then we went to the Bill Maher throws these parties afterwards, and it was like we were on a pendulum where I was here, Chuck Todd was here, and I would move this way and he would move that way. It was like we were kind of playing this game. Anyway, so that was that, and I thought, boy, these guys have such incredibly thin skin. Because I wasn't attacking, on the show, if you watch it, I wasn't attacking Chuck Todd for his personality. I on the show, what I was doing was pointing out something that he had said, and then I was trying to address or critique the trajectory of that concept that he had put out there when he was posing as a spokesperson for the administration rather than being a journalist. Because what he actually was saying was deadly serious. What he was saying is that it's cable catnip to discuss accountability for those who committed acts of torture under the Obama administration, and it was in line with the famed Obama doctrine on these issues, which is that you must look forward, not backward. And anyone who has studied history and accountability efforts knows that you have to hold actions like that, you have to hold individuals who can commit actions like that responsible, or those acts will continue to take place going forward. That's the only way to ensure any form of accountability. And I didn't think that what I was doing was particularly radical, but he went ballistic. Why? Because you had someone that he had never heard of had the audacity to actually challenge him. He's never challenged by the anchors that are sitting in the newsroom doing this. And it's not just Chuck Todd. For the most part, all of them are thin-skinned. Every interaction I've ever had with a TV personality like that, and some newspaper reporters, it's the same way. I was in Baghdad once when I watched John Burns, the famed multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent for the New York Times, attacking the human rights activist Kathy Kelly because she was protesting against the impending U.S. war against Iraq. And so I went up to John Burns, who had done some terrible reporting at the time when I was there, and just challenged him on some of the things that he had been reporting. And he backed up from me when I was just sort of, again, he didn't know me, but I was questioning him on his reporting from the Abu Ghraib prison when Saddam Hussein was in power and emptied the prison. And John Burns reported in the New York Times that many of the Iraqis, there were 30,000 Iraqis released that day by Saddam Hussein right before the war. And John Burns had reported in the New York Times on the front page that many of the Iraqis that were released had thanked George W. Bush for their liberation. So when he's attacking Kathy Kelly, I decided to go up and ask him some questions. He was comparing her, he was basically saying she was a Stalinist. And I went up to John Burns and I said, Mr. Burns, let me just ask you something. I was at the Abu Ghraib prison the entire day yesterday. We were the first reporters to gain access to the Abu Ghraib prison. And I saw you there for about an hour. And you reported that many of the Iraqis thanked George W. Bush for their liberation. How many is many? And he said, what's your point? And I'm like, well, there were 30,000 people released, so is many 20,000, 25,000? And he said, I don't understand your point. And I said, well, if you're going to write that many of the Iraqis thanked George W. Bush for their liberation, I'm assuming the New York Times polled a very huge number of those 30,000 and determined that 20,000 of them wanted to have their personal gratitude conveyed to George W. Bush, who was threatening to bomb the country. And he got so defensive. And I think they were very fair questions, and he's a very powerful journalist. All the news that's fit to print, it says right up in the corner of his paper. So this would be news if 20 of 30,000 Iraqis thanked George Bush for anything. And heck, it'd be amazing if 20 of 30,000 people thanked anyone for anything. So he backs up and he says, out of nowhere, are you saying that the Pulitzer Committee twice erred in awarding me journalism's highest honor? But this is and it's like, and they act like you're this sort of, rabble. And all you're doing is saying, well, you're in this position, in the case of TV journalists, where you're using the public airwaves, or in the case of the New York Times, working for a news organization that proclaims itself all the news that's fit to print, you should be accountable also. You're not an elected official, but you're out there pushing a product to the people of this country and the world, and you should be held accountable. But the skin is so incredibly thin. But as Jeff indicated, the landscape is changing right now. I mean, one of the incredible things, and this is all complicated because the corporations are like vultures and they're swooping in on the internet as well, but we've had some democratization of the methods of distribution for media. And it's given rise to great investigative journalists who a lot of people have never heard of, but they're doing wonderful work. And if you know where to seek it out, you have incredible young journalists that are operating in the spirit of what I.F. Stone did at a very different time in technological history of the United States. I was talking earlier today to some students and faculty here, and I was pointing out the work of someone that many of you have probably never heard of, a woman named Marcy Wheeler, who has an incredible blog that's hosted by firedoglake.com called Empty Wheel. Marcy Wheeler is probably one of the single best reporters on the issue of U.S. government-sponsored torture in this country, regularly scoops the New York Times, and has developed a vibrant community of commenters on her blog that include people that are active members of the U.S. Special Forces community, as well as human rights activists. And it's an incredible resource, and yet you would never hear about it because she almost seldom is credited for the scoops that the other media outlets steal from her and publish without attribution. And thanks to the work of Glenn Greenwald in one case, who was the co-recipient of last year's Izzy, Marcy Wheeler's reporting was quoted in the New York Times and cited in the New York Times because bloggers rallied around her before the Times deadline and said they need to credit her for discovering the systematic waterboarding of two individuals buried in a CIA document. Because of Marcy Wheeler, that came to public light that Abu Zubaydah and another man were waterboarded 280 and 83 times respectively. It was in the New York Times because Marcy Wheeler found it buried in hundreds of pages of declassified documents. Now that may sound, like it's just one small part of a much bigger picture of torture and unaccountability, but the point I'm making is not about that story. The point I'm making is that we have incredible journalists that because of the internet are able to have a forum and put their message out there. At the same, and so you have these bigger corporate media outlets and media figures are kind of in a crisis right now. Because their mansion on the top of the hill is being invaded. The Peggy Noonans of the world who pontificate about how awful the poor are. Their time is coming to an end, and the challenge for young people now is how do we seize this moment when the old empire is in a little bit of trouble, is on the ropes, and we have this challenge to be serious about the business of building independent media, and it's a tremendous challenge. And one point that I want to make, particularly to young people that are aspiring to be journalists that are here tonight, is I think that what is crucial as we move forward in this new media environment, where we have multimedia journalism, where we have blogs, where we have Twitter, where you're communicating ideas with using only 140 characters, which I'm all for, and I think it's a phenomenal development. But if we lose the old school tradition of Izzy Stone-style muckraking, then we're going to lose the battle for the future of journalism that holds those in power accountable and gives voice to the voiceless. We must preserve a system of peer review, of editing, of fact-checking. We have to be on our game. We have to be credible, and we have to be better than the corporate journalists. And there are people that are better than corporate journalists across the board in this country. And the model, though, that we need to build going forward, and the Park Center would be a fantastic place to do that, to start students on this path, is to figure out ways of combining the revolutionary new media tactics with the old school slow-cooked journalism of I.F. Stone. Let's remember something about what Izzy Stone did, particularly with I.F. Stone's Weekly. It wasn't war corresponding from around the world, although he did his fair share of traveling. The service that he provided to the American people was that he would go through volumes and volumes of government documents, and he would find those nuggets of information that, if presented to people in this country, would inform them or empower them. And that was the work that he did, was oftentimes the grueling work of digging through hundreds of pages of publicly available documents. He wasn't someone who was necessarily obtaining classified documents. In fact, I don't think he ever really had a major scoop that was based on some anonymous source giving him something. He just did the simple job of being an active citizen in this country and going through publicly available documents and picking out the information that no one else was focusing on. That's tremendously important work that is being done by almost no one anymore. There are real opportunities right now to stand up and hold those in power right now accountable, and yet we're blowing them at every moment. I said earlier tonight that I thought that if there was ever a moment in modern history, recent history of this country, when we had an opportunity for real change, it was now. And I want to break down some of what I mean by that, particularly in the context of journalism. Barack Obama is the President of the United States, is a Democrat. Democrats have firm control of the Senate. The Democrats have firm control of the House of Representatives. The Obama administration had a tremendous mandate, and they had energized millions of young people to turn on to politics for the first time in a couple of generations. You had an incredible moment when an actual progressive agenda could have been implemented. The Democrats may not have been able, if they were real fighters, to get single-payer health care passed, but they sure as hell could have gotten a public option if they threw the gauntlet down on it. When this White House wants something accomplished, this White House can get it accomplished. When the war spending was being threatened 6 months ago, it was being threatened because the Republicans opposed multi-billion-dollar allocation of U.S. taxpayer funding to the International Monetary Fund. So the Republicans were going to vote against the defense authorization bill because it included funding to the IMF, and they called it a global bailout. So they were opposing the war funding bill, the war supplemental. The funding of the troops was being opposed by the Republicans, which meant that the 70 to 100 so-called anti-war Democrats that are in the House of Representatives actually meant something for a change when it came to an important vote. And so what happened was that the White House very simply made a call and got the 70 to 100 down to 30-something. So there were 30-something holdouts from the Democrats, and I believe at the time what we needed was we needed 29 of them to hold on to block the war funding for that round. And it would have been a symbolic vote. I mean, it wouldn't have actually cut off the war funding, but it would have sent a very strong message. And so what the White House did was they called freshman members of Congress, people that had just swept into Congress on Barack Obama's coattails, and they said, if you don't switch your vote on this, we are not going to be there for you on your next election to campaign for you. Imagine being a first-term congressperson, and the representatives, including Rahm Emanuel and Hillary Clinton, are calling you up and telling you, if you don't vote with us on this, we will not raise money for you and we will not campaign for you. In other words, we will just cut you off. And they flipped people. They flipped enough where they ended up winning that vote. I'm telling you that story because they can play hardball like that when they want to. The war was important enough for them to go in and actually threaten members of their own party. But when it comes to health care, where was that kind of fighting? Where was that kind of throwing down the gauntlet? It simply wasn't there. And so you have an administration that for all practical purposes has either mimicked or been worse than the Bush administration on several foreign policies, has continued some of the worst policies of the Bush era on domestic civil liberties, warrantless wiretapping, on habeas corpus. Guantanamo remains open. Bagram remains a boil on humanity. You have the Obama administration using more private contractors in Afghanistan by a factor of 20 to 30,000 more contractors than the Bush administration used. The occupation of Iraq continues, although downsized and rebranded. Obama continues to use CIA assassination squads, Joint Special Operations Command assassination squads. And then it recently was leaked that the White House now has authorized the assassination of a United States citizen. This man who was born in the United States and is now a cleric in Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki. Now, I don't doubt for a moment, maybe he's a terrible man. Maybe he's done all sorts of bad things around the world. But when you authorize the assassination of one of your own citizens, that should raise some kind of question, particularly from the Democrats in the Congress. And yet, when I last week called all the progressive members of Congress that I keep in touch with from time to time, none of them would call me back. None of them would comment on this. Not Jan Schakowsky, who I talk to all the time. I have her cell phone number, no call back. Russ Feingold, no call back. The only person that would say anything about it, predictably, was Dennis Kucinich, who raised questions about the unconstitutionality of assassinating your own citizen because it takes away your right to due process, and the government then ends up being, in Dennis Kucinich's words, the investigator, the police, the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and the executioner all in one. He said that he has deep fears about the veracity of the Constitution going forward because of that policy. I believe firmly that had that been the policy of George W. Bush, if he leaked that, had that leaked out during his, I mean, he assassinated all sorts of people, but if it had leaked out in that way, we would have heard from those Democrats. They would have spoken up about it. This is a big deal. This is a big moment in recent U.S. history, and yet there was utter silence, even from the so-called left of the Democratic Party establishment. There's a document that was submitted in a lawsuit that was filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights against Donald Rumsfeld and more than 20 other Bush-era officials, stemming from the deaths of two prisoners at Guantanamo. Some of you may be familiar with this story. Scott Horton recently wrote about it in Harper's Magazine, about a secret detention facility called Camp No at Guantanamo, and his reporting, based on interviews with guards that were there, U.S. Military police, soldiers, and special forces guys, indicates that these prisoners who allegedly committed suicide may have actually been killed or died as a result of the injuries that they sustained inside of Camp No. So the lawsuit was filed on behalf of the families of two of these individuals and brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights when Bush was still in power. And it was against Rumsfeld and these 22 other individuals. And what happened was that Rumsfeld and the others came to the Obama administration, because this case was moving forward in the Obama administration, and asked the Obama administration to step in the case. And what they were asking the Obama administration to do was to take, Rumsfeld asked them to take his name and the names of all of these other individuals off of the lawsuit and replace their names with United States, with the words United States, meaning that the lawsuit would not be against Donald Rumsfeld and these 23 others, but against the United States government. And Rumsfeld and the others cited the Westfall Act, which was passed in 1988 as a way of protecting federal employees from tort lawsuits based on conduct that was committed while they were on the job for the government. It's kind of a complicated legal concept, but I think that makes sense. So surely there should be some system of individual accountability for those that authorize policies that later have been determined to be unconstitutional or illegal. Well, what happened was that the Obama administration stepped in and filed a brief supporting Donald Rumsfeld and the 23 other individuals, and Eric Holder's office submitted a legal memorandum backing up their position in this case on June 26th. I think that this document should be required reading of everyone who voted for Barack Obama in this country, because these are the kinds of policies and positions that are being taken right now by the man who campaigned on the change that we need. On June 26th, this past year, they intervened in the lawsuit, and the Assistant Attorney General, Tony West, who is Eric Holder's deputy, wrote the following, and this is a quote: "The type of activities alleged against the individual defendants were foreseeable and were a direct outgrowth of their responsibility to detain and gather intelligence from suspected enemy combatants." He's talking about people that were allegedly tortured to death. In defending the government's position that Rumsfeld shouldn't be the defendant and that the United States should be the defendant, West cited case law, and I'm going to quote from his brief. This is a direct quote from the Assistant Attorney General of the United States under Barack Obama. "Genocide, torture, forced relocation, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by individual defendants employed by Department of Defense and State Department were within the scope of employment." Genocide, torture, forced relocation, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by individual defendants employed by Department of Defense and State Department were within the scope of employment. That is the position of the Obama administration. If you commit genocide, torture, forced relocation, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and you're an employee of the State Department or the Department of Defense, it's within the scope of your employment. This is an abomination, and yet no one has reported on this. It's buried in a court document that was filed in California last June, and there has been zero corporate media coverage of this. This is an astonishing document. In fact, I went around and I talked to scores of lawyers that are representing people that were abused at Guantanamo and Bagram, and I've been taking a poll of them, asking them, was it worse in these legal cases under Obama and Bush? And almost without fail, and some of these are lawyers from big corporate law firms. They're not leftists by any stretch of the imagination. They say almost down to the one that Obama's positions are worse than those taken under the Bush administration in these lawsuits that stem from torture and abuse of prisoners at Guantanamo, Bagram, and elsewhere. Now, we can talk about this, and it's important to bring all of this to light, and it's important to have the moral courage to be consistent. If we were against it under Bush, we must be against it under Obama. This is not about anything having to do with partisan politics. This is about the future of the country, what kind of country we want to live in, and what kind of country we want to build, what kind of nation we want to be, what kind of people we want to be. But at the same time, while those of us, and I'm sure there are many of you in this room that are fighting for that kind of justice, fighting for that kind of accountability, we also are facing incredible racism against the president, lies that are being told about policies that are bad for a lot of reasons, but not for the reasons that the right wing is lying about. And we're living in a time when this president has had his life threatened more times than any other president in history. Think of the moral challenge to be a resistor in a time like that, when you have real threats against the president, when you have these gun nuts running around on St. Timothy McVeigh Day, when you have people that actually are motivated by the politics of racism in this country, it's a great challenge to figure out how to keep moral clarity on these issues, because you have to decide, where am I going to spend my energy? Fighting against a lie machine that's telling lies about policies that aren't that good, but they're still lies? Or am I going to keep fighting those same fights that I was fighting when Bush was president, when Clinton was president, Reagan, the other Bush? It's a very, very challenging moment to be an independent-minded person, an independent-minded journalist, to be independent. But it's times like this where people are actually called to some level of individual greatness that's not about fame or celebrity, but is about standing up and doing the right thing. We're not going to win any popularity contest by being independent journalists. We're going to get thrown out of events by the Democrats and the Republicans. We're going to be denied press credentials, and it happens all the time. We're going to be marginalized and called biased and say that we're activists. I would put forward that the activists are the ones that control the corporate media. They're activists for the powerful. So it's an incredibly challenging time, but it's also, I think, a very exciting time to be a young person entering this world. And I'll tell you this, if you want to make no money and you want to work really hard, the thing to do right now is to become an independent journalist. I loved seeing the $5 check for Izzy Stone's weekly that was signed by Albert Einstein. And if you haven't seen the small exhibit that they have up there, it's really tremendous. I would say that the best thing that ever happened to me was begging my way into Democracy Now! When I was, I don't know, I was like 20 years old. And some of you may have heard me talk about this before. And this is how I'll end tonight, is just by explaining how I accidentally stumbled into journalism. I was working at a homeless shelter in D.C., the Community for Creative Nonviolence, and I was mopping floors and taking old guys to the VA or helping them fill out paperwork so they could get benefits. And I had dropped out of college because I was a hard-headed guy, and I thought my teachers were full of it, and felt like they weren't helping students in social justice struggles on the campus of the University of Wisconsin. So I was like, skip them, and I left, and I hitchhiked out to D.C. And I moved into the Community for Creative Nonviolence. I was working there, and it was right around the time when Democracy Now! Came on the air in 1996, and I would walk around with headphones on, listening to talk radio. I'd never heard of Pacifica Radio. I didn't even know there was such thing as community media. And I heard this incredible show, and it was like life-changing. I couldn't believe that such a thing even existed. And I said, I want to be a part of that. And I kind of shelved that dream, and I was at Jonah House in Baltimore and had the honor of living and working with Phil Berrigan and his wife Liz McAllister and their community there, and got a real political education there. And I ended up moving to New York, to the New York Catholic Worker, and spent a lot of time bathing older guys and taking them to appointments and giving. I had a very strong stomach, and I always had it as a kid, and I would give people with HIV/AIDS baths at the Catholic Worker, and we would always listen to WBAI in New York. Me and my friend Carmen Trotta were addicted to it, and we'd listen to Amy Goodman, and I was like, oh, that's that person. I want to be like her. or be a part of anything she does. And I started calling her. From the Catholic worker has one phone, I would call her at her office and say, the first thing I ever said to her is, if you have a dog, I'll walk your dog. And I started calling her. She had a cat at the time, but she can't really. As Amy recalls, I never actually kind of told her my name. I just started in the middle of a sentence, and I'm sure I seemed like a complete weirdo. And I eventually, after all these calls, she must have thought I was nuts. I finally met her at this exhibit that we had done about the life of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, and I went up to her, and I had struck up this relationship with this wonderful old African-American journalist named William Worthy. And William Worthy had become a friend of mine, and that's for a different time. But I went up to Amy and said, "You really should interview this guy, Bill Worthy," and she ended up having him on the show. And then I pursued her, and she said, "Well, you can come in one day if you want to volunteer, but we really don't take interns or anything like that. So I'm not sure if it's going to work out." And I went up to WBAI, which at the time was across the street from Madison Square Garden. And I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it's crazy. You're going in, and I think it was like on the 35th floor or something of the building. And I go up to WBAI, and I walked into the office, and I thought it was Amy Goodman's. The whole thing was Amy Goodman's, but it was a whole radio station. And the first person that I saw, I said, I'm here to see Miss Amy Goodman. And he's like, "Who?" So that was my introduction to it. Anyway, they lead me into this what looked like a closet with all these newspapers and reel-to-reel tapes stacked up. And they sit me down and said, "You can wait for her here." And I sat, 15 minutes goes by, half hour goes by, an hour goes by, and then finally Amy comes in like with newspapers hanging every which way and reel-to-reel tapes and headphones like this and 2 tape recorders. And she comes in, she's like, "Oh, right. Like, looks like I was the last person she wanted to see." And she's like, "Okay, just go through these papers and clip every article about Iraq." This is in end of 1997. And so I start going through it, and I didn't see her for hours. And I'm going through clipping. And then she finally comes in sort of at the end of the day and sits down in there in this what I thought was a closet that they put me in, and sort of starts to make some small talk with me. And then I said, "So where is your office?" And she goes, "You're in it." And she worked in this like place with no ventilation, no windows, nothing. And it was just Amy and one other person full-time, and then they had a half-time producer who worked full-time but was being paid half-time. And I was there 14 hours that day, and I kind of never left. And I had this incredible opportunity to study. I had never taken a journalism class in my life. I got turned down for an internship at The Nation. I couldn't get into journalism school when I tried, when I was at the university. And yet Amy Goodman, for some reason, let some guy who kind of stalked her about walking her dog and never apparently told her name to work there. And she started paying me $40 out of her pocket to write the news headlines in the morning at Democracy Now! When it was on a couple dozen radio stations. It had just been kicked off of every radio station in the state of Pennsylvania for airing the commentaries of Mumia Abu-Jamal, the death row prisoner, when I first arrived at Democracy Now! And so I learned journalism as a trade, not as a career or in the pursuit of fame or money or anything like that, but because I met all these people for whom journalism was a way of life. It burned in their heart, and it wasn't about anything except trying to provide a public service, trying to fight for justice using a microphone as your weapon instead of a gun, trying to use the pad of paper as a weapon instead of a bomb. And to me, it was like it was an incredible experience to learn a trade, like being a plumber or a mechanic or an electrician, because journalism should be a working person's job, because you're doing the work of the people by being a journalist. And I don't think anyone embodied that spirit more than I.F. Stone, and I'm honored to receive this award tonight. Thank you very much. Well, that's actually a very good point. I mean, you had these hootery or huttery people that were arrested for allegedly conspiring to potentially put roadside bombs and blow up law enforcement officials on their way to a funeral of another law enforcement official that they allegedly had conspired to kill. And the use of the word terrorist is very selective in this society. But the Blackwater example, when Blackwater first tried to open shop where it did in North Carolina, there was resistance from the local population there in the mid-'90s because they feared that they were nothing more than a sort of elevated militia. And I think that there are grounds to compare what Blackwater is doing to a militia-type group, particularly when you consider that they have gone into the streets of a U.S. city with M4 assault rifles, proclaiming that they were there to confront criminals and stop looters. The fact that they have shown have a track record killing individuals whose religion they don't like or whose country they believe should be, wiped off the earth. Yeah, I mean it's all in how you define terms. But yeah, I mean Blackwater is like a huge militia.
You mentioned Colombia in the beginning, so I wanted to turn it a little bit to Latin America, and particularly the what I see as a very covered up event that happened not long ago, less than a year ago, in Honduras. A coup that, a military coup that basically deposed a democratically elected president that was pushing for for social spending and wage increases, and a very controversial role that the U.S. Played in all this.
Right.
So I wanted you to, if you could comment on the role of the media in covering that event.
Well, I mean, it was a non-story when it comes to any of the complexity of who Manuel Zelaya was and what the actual issues were, and there was a lot of oversimplified reporting about the Honduran Constitution. I mean, in fact, I was working with Democracy Now! We went to great lengths to try to get accurate translations of the various articles of the Honduran Constitution that were in question, and it was infinitely more complicated than not only the major U.S. media outlets were portraying it, but also Senator John Kerry and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made statements that probably were almost entirely incorrect about the Honduran Constitution. What I thought was particularly interesting is that the military people that were involved with that coup, some of the leaders had received training at the U.S. Army School of the Americas, but also the fact that Honduras is one of the premier recruiting and training grounds for U.S. mercenaries, U.S. hired mercenaries that then go for deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a U.S. company called ID Solutions that set up base in Le Partique in Honduras at the former base used by Battalion 316, which was the CIA-funded death squad in the 1980s. It was converted then into a private company's base that was used to train and ready mercenaries from throughout Latin America for deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, there's many dimensions to what happened in Honduras before the coup and in the events following the coup. But the only story that was portrayed is that Zelaya tried to change the Constitution to stay in power, and Izzy Stone said governments lie. The U.S. government told a lot of lies about that situation, and I think that that media outlets did a real disservice by not digging deeper into it. It's still a non-story, but for people throughout Latin America, it's a very big story, as you know.
Thank you for being here. I suspect that because there are so many contractors in the Department of Defense, not just Blackwater but other ones, that there's probably contractors all over the government that, most people don't know about. I know something about the U.S. Department of Education, the same contractor that answered the phones at the Department of Defense, a company called Vangent, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of a huge textbook monopoly called Pearson's. The same company answered the phones at the Department of Defense and the Department of Education under the Bush administration. And I was wondering if you knew of any other rather outrageous conflicts of interest in other parts of the government.
Well,
that we ought to
you want
know
them
about.
alphabetically, chronologically, grouped by subject?
Well, Department of Education is of interest to me, but...
It was interesting under the Bush administration. It was Neil Bush was getting all these huge contracts for his software Excite. You can go into any aspect of the federal bureaucracy, and it's from top to bottom just full of contractors. In fact, a couple years ago in Vanity Fair, Bartlett and Steele, the old school sort of investigative journalists, did an incredible piece of investigative reporting on the role of contractors, not in war zones exclusively, but throughout the entire federal bureaucracy. And they determined that, I think it was 90% of everyone in this country, in the United States, that makes $100,000 or less might as well pay everything they owe in taxes directly to a private company of their choice. That's how much contractors, they constitute 90% of the tax revenue generated by people in this country who make $100,000 or less. It's an incredible amount of money that they should just remit their tax payments directly to contractors. There's 18 intelligence agencies in the United States. 70% of all spending on their combined budgets goes to hiring private contractors. 70%. I mean, we are the most radically privatized society on earth, and it's getting worse and worse. Every aspect of our life is privatized. So you're saying, any other, the whole system is outrageous. The entire system is outrageous. Everything we do is linked to profits. They're defunding public schools, privatizing schools. The healthcare plan, whether it's the Democrat mainstream or the Republican mainstream, is all about profit. It's all about big pharma. It's all about the insurance lobby. Both parties. Everything is about privatization and profit. Every aspect of our life is linked to profit. So, you could write a million books about this stuff in the United States alone. And the experience that you're describing, I'm sure, is replicated by many people in this room anytime they have to deal with the federal bureaucracy. Ask veterans what it's like to call up and try to find out information about your benefits. I'm not talking about Vietnam and Korea war vets. I'm talking about current Iraq and Afghanistan vets. Paul Rykoff, who is a fairly mainstream Iraq war veteran who runs an organization, advocacy organization, talks about this all the time, that they have hour-long waits when they call on the phones because contractors are answering the phones there. It's not efficient. It's everything. It's the opposite of everything they said it would be. It's the opposite of competitive. It's the opposite of better product because private market is going to save everything in Thomas Friedman's little dream world.
I just read that Sally Mae last year got the contract to collect delinquent accounts for the IRS.
Great. Cupcakes for everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, no, that's Fannie. Never mind.
Hi. You were talking earlier about President Obama and how a lot of his policies are a lot more conservative than we ever thought they would be. And I was wondering, is there any evidence that he's doing that to stay alive? Because we know a lot about the threats to his life, and I was wondering, are any of those coming from right-wing sources so close to him that they could actually do harm to him?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I tend to doubt that actually quite strongly because I think that the one thing the thing you said there that I would really disagree with is you're saying he's more conservative than we thought he was. I mean, well, putting aside the term conservative and just going with your point, which is that his policies are kind of worse than we thought that they would be. I actually think that Obama pretty much telegraphed his pass on the campaign trail, and I think what happened is that a lot of people got wrapped up in the simple campaign rhetoric about change we can believe in, and I'm going to put an end to this and this. But the things he was going to put an end to were all very vague concepts. But if you actually read his policy papers, there are a few policies that he has failed to make good on, namely the closing of Guantanamo, and there are others that have to do with health care. I mean, there are parts of his program that you can point out and say, Obama is not accountable. He didn't make good on the promise to do that. But largely speaking, Obama was a fairly right-of-center Democrat in terms of the actual platform that he campaigned on. I don't think that established power in this country has anything to fear from Barack Obama. I think they feel extremely comfortable with Obama in the White House. The people that I think are dangerous are the disempowered fringies that are part of the AstroTurf Tea Party movement, the more sort of militia types. I think they're the ones that are making the threats. The sad reality is I think established power is perfectly content to have Barack Obama in the White House. In fact, I would say that he's done more to extend the tentacles of the, pardon the use of the term, the U.S. empire than McCain could have done in 2 terms, or 5 for that matter. I mean, Obama's repairing the relationship, or repairing the image of the United States without actually changing the policies. That's an incredible victory for U.S. imperialism, to be blunt about it. And, I mean, that's, maybe you disagree. You're welcome to. That's my sense of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. This was going to be a 2-part question, but my good friend who asked about Blackwater's arsenal got to the first half, so this is kind of a follow-up to that. I'm interested in knowing whether or not the use of Blackwater in places like Katrina or potentially other domestic disasters could be seen as a violation of posse comitatus, and them being private might negate that. I know that I think it was called the John Warner Defense Bill of 2006, very quietly, posse comitatus was kind of erased, and I thought there was an attempt to bring it back, but if I recall, both were done in the typically vague language that couldn't allow it to go either way. So, is Blackwater in Katrina a violation of posse comitatus?
Well, you know, I do actually address this in my book, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've discussed this with a number of constitutional law experts, and there are serious questions about whether the use of retired or former military in an official capacity for the government, which Blackwater was in some of its operations in Katrina. It was on the payroll of the Department of Homeland Security. They were hired as the protective force for a FEMA operation that wasn't in existence when Blackwater was guarding it. They were just there, and there was no FEMA to guard, but they were there anyway. So, you know, you have former Navy SEALs, Delta Force, 82nd Airborne, patrolling the streets of a U.S. city as private guards. Yeah, it raises serious constitutional questions. But at that time also, the president had lifted posse comitatus, because then you had actual active duty military forces. I mean, I followed around the 82nd Airborne for quite a while in New Orleans, watching their operations, and you know, they were full-on soldiers. So posse comitatus was thrown out the window. I would argue, you know, not from a legal perspective, but based on talking to lawyers, that the use of these kind of private contractors on U.S. soil is a violation of the Anti-Pinkerton Act of 1892, which prohibits the U.S. government from doing business with a paramilitary or quasi-paramilitary organization. I mean, the whole thing is probably illegal under that act, and yet no one has even raised it. It hasn't been, they haven't challenged it at all. So, yeah, posse comitatus, but more, what are we doing business with a mercenary organization? We banned that, you know, when there were still people that were enslaved in this country. I mean, and we're still using the mercenaries. I should also tell people, I'm sure many people are not aware of this, there's a division of the U.S. military that is entirely exempt from posse comitatus, which is the Joint Special Operations Command, that from 03 to 08 was commanded by General Stanley McChrystal. And it's the cream of the crop it's like the all-star team of the military. And it's the premier counterterrorism force of the U.S. military that used to have the job of attaching itself to foreign militaries, training them, having a small U.S. footprint that would allow to control friendly foreign forces, and they got involved with all sorts of unsavory activities around the world. After 9/11, the Bush administration redirected JSOC and made it an offensive force that would carry out what in the parlance of the Special Forces world are called direct actions, i.e. lethal actions. So they operate under special access programs with teams called special missions units, and they literally are assassination squads roaming the globe, totally unaccountable force, and they are allowed to pursue people on U.S. soil and around the globe. And it goes back to a presidential directive that was signed under President Clinton's presidency. Clinton was the one who initially gave them an exemption from posse comitatus, and Bush then expanded it and put it on steroids, and now they're this what they call unattributable, unaccountable force. And what Obama has done, and I think this is one of the most disturbing aspects of his foreign policy, is that he promoted McChrystal, who was the head of this dark side force, the darkest of the dark, darker than the CIA, to be the head of all U.S. military operations in the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater of operations. And we're seeing an increasing presence of covert U.S. operators inside of Pakistan as well, which no one wants to talk about.
It strikes me as reminiscent of sending Negroponte to Iraq. And just if I could, I'd ask, do you have any suggestions as a response to this? Because it seems to me to be something that's completely unacceptable, to use the U.S. military against U.S. citizens, and should be very clear-cut. So what can we do?
Well, normally you could say, well, we'll go to that handful of Congress people that get it, and we'll try to get, multiply them and move from 5 to 6 to 7. And it's like when you can only get one congressperson to even comment on the fact that the president wants to assassinate U.S. citizens. I mean, that's why I was joking with my man before. I mean, I'm passed out razor blades. I actually think that I think it's a really tough landscape right now in this country, and I don't see a lot of people fighting. I also think that a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet right now, and if you're fighting to try to keep your family's head above the water, it's really hard to find time to anything having to do with foreign wars and military on your soil, and Yeah, that's why I think the future is in. I think young people getting involved with independent journalism is a big part of changing this country. Take back, we could build powerful media movements, and I don't mean power in the sense of corporations. I mean power in the sense of turning young people onto politics. It was one of the great things that Obama did on that campaign. He energized a lot of young people. But now we run the risk of deflating an entire generation of people that could have gotten involved. And you can turn back to a reality where the reality is the Real Housewives, and the other stuff is a sideshow. Iraq, JSOC, Posse Comitatus. Who cares when I have Justin Bieber to watch?
Well, thank you. I've been wondering about that for a while.
About Justin Bieber?
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed your writing, and I think a lot of us have, but you're as entertaining and motivating speaker as a writer.
This is my cousin, and I'm paying him.
Actually, my name is Luke, and in addition to practicing as an attorney in town, I also write for some of the local papers and have started up an internet magazine as well. Following up just from what you were talking about in terms of looking to young people, both in terms of political action as well as journalism, I'm interested in asking you, you spoke both of this time kind of begging for moral and political courage, but also as media as a trade. And it seems as if it's more and more difficult for people to make a living through any sort of writing or any sort of journalism, certainly this sort of journalism that many of us believe in. And I feel as if there was a time at which newspapers didn't act out of some public service. They wanted to sell papers, and that writing government was part of that. And I wonder, at a time in which we're looking to nonprofits like The Nation or ProPublica, or...
The Nation isn't a nonprofit, by the way. It just doesn't make any money, but it's not a nonprofit. They sell ad revenue, but it's underwritten from the generosity of people that give without a tax break, basically. And I mean, I work for I actually think I want you to finish, but I think this is an important point for journalists. I go out and beg every year for funding that I have to figure out how to get donated to a 501c3 so I can do my work. I'm not on staff at The Nation magazine. In fact, The Nation had to cut some staffing, which was really sad because we knew people that were essentially laid off. So it exists on the generosity of others, but it's not a nonprofit. It just doesn't make a profit. Okay.
Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah, sorry.
But so if you and even folks like Mark Danner or Matt Taibbi are the exception to the rule in terms of making a living, then do you believe that there is a path for young journalists to be successful at affecting political change as well as working in the media?
Well, I think this new reality is I think still just that. It's new, and I was talking to Adelaide at dinner tonight about this. I think that places like Ithaca College could help to facilitate a kind of new way of looking at the participation of young journalists in a new media culture, and I think that we have to find alternative ways of funding that are not dependent on corporations. I think media collectives are one road to go down, where you have people that have day jobs and they are citizen journalists in other aspects of their life. In fact, I've got years of my life where that's what I've done. I happen to have written a book that inadvertently did well, so I've been okay for the past couple of years and haven't had to fight as hard as I always have to find a way to make ends meet. But a year or two from now, I'll go back to doing the same thing. It goes in cycles. So I think collectives, community journalism is just that. It should be communal. But I also think that there's this whole philanthropic world that funds a lot of fluff, and I think that we have a lot of bright young people that should start to hit up some of these foundations that are funding fluff and say, how about funding a project that does X, Y, and Z? And we're gonna get we want you to buy a huge condo in New York, and every year we want you to have 10 kids that get free rent in that condo, and they have a year to try to make an independent media project work, and we'll give you a stipend, and you're not going to make a lot of money, In fact, we're not going to pay you a salary. We're going to pay your living expenses and put you here, and what you do with it is the challenge. To me, that would be one of the greatest contributions to giving young people a chance to try to start and have a year where they don't have to worry about how the hell am I going to pay my rent, and somebody says to them, you know what, we're going to give you a place to live, we're going to give you a stipend, and you do what you can with that. And make it competitive to get those positions, but also make it available to young people without resources. I think it would be a tremendous thing. There are people with money in this country that throw it away at stuff that doesn't result in any social change. And I mean, that's why I credit the Park Foundation with doing what they've done, because it's an incredibly good use of money to make these kinds of programs.
A very brief question. I served in the military when there was a draft, and I wanted to ask you what you felt about reinstituting a real draft, no exemptions. I found two observations. One was, when we had a draft, there was much more reluctance to follow orders, which I think was positive. There was an evaluation of whether this is stupid or not. Secondly, I think, I doubt whether we would have gone to war in Iraq if we had a draft in which folks of all classes, economic classes, would have had something at risk. And I wanted to ask you what your opinion is about reinstituting a real live, no deferment draft in place of what we presently have.
First, let me say that I agree with your political conclusion, the second half of what you said entirely. I think if there was a draft, there probably would not have been, I think they would have had a very difficult time pushing through the invasion and occupation of Iraq. It may have been politically untenable. I'm against a draft, but from a moral position that I don't think that anyone should be required to pick up a weapon for any reason whatsoever. But I understand in real political terms why you're raising that, and why, for instance, Representative Charlie Rangel of New York has for years been talking about bringing back a draft. Because what he says, we have to democratize the sacrifice, because the Bush twins are certainly not in need of signing up to go to war so that they can pay for a college education. But a lot of kids from Charlie Rangel's district in Harlem are in that position where they sign up in an effort to get a college education, or for lack of something else to do, which is also what's happening a lot, and because the recruiters come into the schools and they make it sound good. So I agree with your logic, but I'm against a draft. But I agree with the logic behind what you're saying, and I agree with your political conclusion. But I don't think that the ends would justify the means in that case. If you understand what I'm saying.
If there were options to serving in the military, such as national service or becoming a medic or something along that line, would that ameliorate your opinion at all?
No, because I don't think that anyone. I believe that this country has ceased to fight wars of self-defense. We're not fighting wars of self-defense. I could see the logic of that if we were actually under attack from a military around the world. You know, I just don't think people should be forced to have anything to do with war if they're morally opposed to it. I mean, again, you and I probably agree on the logic of it. I just don't agree with the morality of forcing people to be a part of mass violence, which is what military operations result in. Even if you're a medic, I know a lot of medics that went through Iraq that are just traumatized individuals from what they experienced there. And I'm sure you have your own stories from people that you serve with. So I agree with your political logic. My moral position would be that I would be against it. Thank you. Thanks for raising it. Oh, I know you.
I promise to make it very short. First of all, congratulations. Thank you for all the work you do and continue to do. And I just wanted to invite people to Syracuse on Sunday, because just maybe people know this, but the unmanned drones that are used in Pakistan and Afghanistan are manned at Hancock Airport right here in Syracuse, and the Syracuse Peace Council, in their great effort to continue a presence there, has called for a presence there on Sunday. And so I invite especially the journalists, students to come up, but anybody to come up. It's from 1 to 2, and that's all I wanted to say.
That's actually that would be a great story for if you guys aren't already doing it, for journalists, students here. It's good to do, because the drone war, it's an incredibly horrible story. It basically turns war into a video game, and there are a few locations around the United States where this takes place, and there's been some good investigative journalism around Creech Air Force Base, which is based in the southwest of the United States, but you have a part of the war literally in your backyard here, and it's a story that really needs telling, and it would be a great project for young journalists here to undertake.
Yes, and so if anybody wants a ride, you can contact me. I'll be in the back. Thank you.
Jeremy's going to make one last comment, an event that happened to him that he'd like to describe, and then I want to remind everyone that there are books, Blackwater books, he's going to sign and mingle. I want to thank you all for being here at the second annual Izzy Award ceremony, and thank our listeners on WEOS, and here's the final word from Jeremy.
Jeff said that I should mention this story, but here's how he started off, which has to do with the Overseas Press Club Award. I'll just tell the truncated version of it. I was working with Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! We did a documentary about Nigeria and Chevron's role, the Chevron Oil Corporation's role in killing unarmed indigenous villagers in the Niger Delta, in a very oil-rich region of Nigeria. And we did this documentary called Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. And it won all these awards, and we were getting some kind of an award from the Overseas Press Club Association. It's a very fancy gala, and I had never won an award before that or anything, and I was wearing blue jeans to a thing where everyone else was in tuxedos, and we didn't realize that we had to reserve a table. We thought it was just going to be like this, where you come and you get in, you give a talk and then you leave, and something like that. So we go to this thing. It's a fancy dinner, and it was emceed by Tom Brokaw, and this was in 1999, and the keynote speaker was Richard Holbrooke, who currently is President Obama's special envoy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Holbrooke is just a notorious hawk who manages to find his way into every Democratic administration one way or another, going all the way back to when he cut his teeth working for Henry Kissinger in Vietnam. But Holbrooke at the time was President Clinton's nominee to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And he had been the trigger man on the war in Yugoslavia. He was the one that went over and delivered the ultimatum to Slobodan Milosevic leading up to the NATO bombing that went on for 78 days in 1999. And so when we went to this ceremony, Amy and I were particularly interested in interviewing Richard Holbrooke, and we figured, well, since we're winning an award, we certainly will be in proximity to him. So we arrived there, and we're totally underdressed for the thing, and we almost got tossed out before we even got in. And the press person, we sought out the press person for the event, and we asked her, is there going to be a time when we could sit down with Ambassador Holbrooke? And she said, no, there won't be a time when you could sit down with Ambassador Holbrooke. And we said, well, okay, we don't need a one-on-one interview, but is he going to have a press conference later? Because mind you, we're in the middle of bombing Yugoslavia, and Holbrooke was the trigger man, and he's the nominee to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And they said, oh, no, actually, we have an agreement. This is the Overseas Press Club. We have an agreement with Ambassador Holbrooke that if he speaks tonight, he doesn't have to answer any questions. It's 300 journalists, like supposedly the best foreign correspondents in the country, are in this room, and no one's going to ask Richard Holbrooke a question. So the thing starts, and the head of the Overseas Press Club Awards, Overseas Press Club, praises Indonesia for its treatment of journalists. Indonesia was beating journalists, killing journalists, disappearing them. So the whole thing just starts out awful. So then Holbrooke gets up and he announces, for the first time ever, he makes news that night, and several correspondents rush out of the room, that the United States that night had bombed radio television Serbia, killing 16 media workers. And I subsequently would meet the families of those individuals and see the scene. But Holbrooke said that, and there was a smattering of applause and a gathering of journalists, and Holbrooke called it a tremendous